So let's dive in here. We have a really good mixture of people. A lot of people that have not done Composer before, new to Composer. People that are using Composer in their workflow right now. I hope you get some new stuff out of this. And if you have further questions afterwards, just tackle me and we'll talk about them. Because we won't get to everything, but we will certainly get to plenty of stuff so you guys that have not used it before, just in the beginning, will know how to use it and like why would you would use it and the advantages and the workflow to using it and all those types of things. Let's see if I can wander around a little bit here. Yes, I can. Cool. So my title was Composer PHP Package Manager. My more interesting title is Composer, the cool kid at the party. See what I did there? So Composer is, as you'll see, is the little gem at the center of the PHP community that's is already making everybody kind of get along better, become better friends, and kind of work together. So we'll get that in a second. I already talked about me. Basically, the most important thing about me is I do documentation for Symfony. And actually, the reason that I do the documentation for Symfony is a French technology. And so it turns out that everyone that uses Symfony, that's like really well known, they speak English as a second language. So if you speak English as a first language, you just rise straight to the top of the documentation. And here I am. So if you do speak English as a first language and you want to become, fabulously famous for some random little documentation thing inside, then come find our repository and start doing some pull requests. And I would say, most importantly, I'm the husband of Leanna out there who's no longer paying attention. Hey! So she runs our company, but we're also married. Cool. So, life before Composer and components. And first of all, I want to back up and kind of define what I mean by components. I am going to talk about Composer primarily, but I want to back up and talk about components. Many of you may know this term. When I talk about components, I'm talking about a small PHP library. So not a Drupal module or a Symfony bundler plugin or a Recording Igniter plugin. Some small PHP library that you could use inside of any project. So an example would be, this is an old example. How many of you guys have brought in the PHP Excel library into your project? Yeah, so that's kind of an older thing, but that's an example of it doesn't matter where you are, you can just bring this library and start using it. So that's what I mean by when I say components. So the first thing with PHP before we actually get into the Composer stuff is I have to tell you a story about the way things have been in PHP. And if you've done PHP for at least even a few years, then we can sort of have this, sob story together. So first, in the PHP world, we really suck at sharing. Typically including external libraries in your application, so you're coding away, making PHP files, doing your PHP thing, and then all of a sudden you meet some problem that an external library can help you with. It's actually kind of a pain in the butt to bring it in. So in a lot of cases, we just wouldn't bring it in. We'd be like, screw it, I'll just do it myself. So why does it suck? One, how do I auto-load their files? First of all, what do I mean by auto-loading? Somebody shout out. Yeah, we will get that. What does that mean, though, in layman's terms?
It's just the ability to automatically load a class file.
That's it. Yeah, perfectly said. Actually, I just realized I'm going to put my glasses on so that I'm infinitely less blind. Because I was like, there's noises coming from 10 feet away from me, and I don't know who's talking. So yeah, first of all, do I have to do a require statement for all their PHP classes, that kind of stuff? Second, does their library depend on any other library? So I need to download this and also these other three things. And then finally, how do I even store their files in my project? So typically, it literally means I don't know, just download it and commit it to Subversion or Git. Just literally download my stuff and just commit it into your project. That's typically not what we want to do. Just because we don't want to bloat our repository with other people's stuff, but that's kind of what we are forced to do. So, example of this is coming from the Symfony 1 world. This is one of my favorite examples because it's just so darn crazy. So this right here is documentation on Symfony's website, Symfony 1, on how to bring in a little piece of Zen Framework. This is really great. Zen Framework 1 was all component-based, perfect for bringing just little pieces into your project. So it should be exactly what we want to solve small problems. So step one was manually download the library and commit it into your project. So already you have to download this entire thing and just literally, just commit it. Maybe if it's up on Subversion somewhere, we can use SVN externals at best. Step two, and I love this. Okay, so you just download this big thing, you don't know Zen Framework that well, but go into it and just delete most of it. But don't delete that directory because we need that one, but we don't need these three over here. And definitely don't delete that file, because if you delete that file, you're in big trouble, you have to start over again. So quite literally, you have to go in here, keep these two files and those two directories. This is the directory we wanted, but these files and directories are kind of dependencies on them. And of course, there's no way that you know that short of reading the documentation or tackling the guy that makes Zen Framework and asking him what things we need. And the third thing is the auto-loading, again, like the not having to use require and include statements all over your code, like, how do I get access to the Zen Framework stuff? And like this is actually the code. So if you looked at Zen Framework docs, and this is not knocking Zen Framework, like every framework was like this or worse. The fact that Zen Framework was even built in components made this at least possible. So you have to set include path, we have to require some random file, we have to call this autoloader get instance type of thing. So this is the code we'd actually have to look up and fit into our project somewhere so we can start using Zen Framework's classes. So that was all a huge pain in the butt, so basically we either kind of suffered through that or we didn't do it at all. The second thing, this is the kind of the more emotional side of it, is that we haven't really been working together. So the nice thing about PHP, and also the bad thing, but the nice thing primarily is that like we're a really huge community. We like sort of dominate the web. So this is a good thing. We're kind of like running the show in a sense. So this is a graph of just PHP versus Ruby, just to pick one out of a hat of web technologies. Okay. And obviously, like PHP, as we'd expect, is like way above them. Now, let's go into. So I want to talk about fragmentation of our community. Let's go into kind of comparing the individual frameworks under those languages. So obviously for Ruby, I'm just going to pick out Rails because they're the dominant one. And PHP, I just picked out at random. I picked out Zen Framework and I picked out Symfony. I also could have picked out, I've done this before, so I could have picked out Yi and CodeIgniter, and they would have been lines that looked very similar to Symfony and Zen Framework. So what happened here? All of a sudden, look, I have Ruby on Rails in blue and ROR on red, which is probably picking up some other stuff. But basically, Ruby on Rails is dominating us. And then we're all kind of like down here. So we came from this big thing where it's like PHP rules the world, right? Not really, because there's no actual cooperation between the PHP communities. So really, we're not up here. We are one of these. Just pick a line down here, and this is actually where we are. So we should have all the best solutions, all the best technology, all the best documentation. We should be like leading things, and we haven't been. And one of the reasons is because we're just dividing ourselves. Of course, this is changing. And the side point to this is, and this is not to pick out on anybody, but this literally I did this once. I was like, I'm inside of Symfony project, Zen Framework project, and I need to deal with authorize.net. That really sucks. So let's find something to help us with that. So I go to GitHub and I Google for authorize and I search for PHP repositories. What do I get? 3 Cake PHP plugins and a CodeIgniter plugin. Just throw whatever it is that's not valuable at the ground. It's like totally screwed at that point. So I realized that like there are nice solutions out there, but I can't use them because I'm not inside of CodeIgniter. In fact, this one down here, 200 stars, 54 forks. That's actually a really nice library. Too bad. So fragmentation as a community, there's more information that we all have to know, because I need to know about Zen Framework to bring it in if I want to use it. It's difficult to hire, and if any of you guys have been in a hiring position before, you see this. So I was like, no, I need a Symfony developer, not like this PHP guy over here. It's totally different. Or Drupal developer versus framework developer. Difficult to hire, disjointed forums, because you're Googling things specific to CodeIgniter or Zen Framework. And of course, we don't have any interoperability, or at least we haven't in the past. Everybody's been kind of doing their own thing. So again, the key to all this is that components are shareable across all of PHP. A second ago, we were looking at like Cake PHP plugins and CodeIgniter plugins. Those are not components; they're specific to their framework. Drupal module is another example. Components, though, we can share those across PHP. So this, fortunately, is changing, has been changing for about like the last 2 years or so. And in fact, the entire PHP community has just been doing leapfrogs over the past 2 or 3 years as far as like getting their tools up to date and kind of catching up and kind of starting to lead the other communities, like comparing us to Ruby or comparing us to Python. So this is what I heard in the back earlier. The PHP Framework Interoperability Group. How many people have heard of this before? Expect a few hands. And what is it? Somebody yell out. What does it mean? What does it mean? What does this group do?
Isn't that like all the framework developers that come up and build the standards?
Yeah, perfectly said. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm looking for. Yeah. So basically, it's the United Nations of PHP. And so because there were all these like warring clans, it was like, okay, a couple of guys like walked to the center of the circle of fire and basically said we need to actually start playing nice with each other. We don't necessarily all have to come in together and work together, but we need to at least have some consistency between what we're doing, because it's going to make our life, actually the actual end developers, much, much easier. So the first thing that they solved was the problem of autoloading. And again, the idea of like, if I'm in a Symfony project and I want to use Zen framework classes, how do I use those without having to have require statements? And before what I'm about to show you, everyone was solving that themselves. So when I brought Zen Framework in, I had directions on how to use Zen Framework's autoloader and how to set all that up. And as long as I did that their way correctly, then I could start using their classes without require statements. And I covered this earlier. And the point of it, when you hear the word autoloader, because this was mysterious to me for a long, long time, it's just in all modern frameworks and technologies, we start running around just referencing class names. Whereas like 5 years ago, we always had require statements everywhere. There is actually a magical function somewhere that makes that possible. Meaning, like, if I'm about to reference a class called foo, something in my code somewhere must have required the file that contains foo. Must have. The fact that we don't have a require statement anymore is because there's an invisible function in the background that at the moment that we reference the class called foo the very first time, that function is called. It goes and locates the file that has the class foo on it and requires it on our behalf. So that's kind of like the extra credit here of like what an autoloader means and how that works. It is not something that when your application starts, goes and finds every single file in your entire system and requires them all at once and then blows up your memory footprint. It doesn't work that way. It's much more sophisticated and kind of magical than that. Though it has the same end purpose where you don't have to have require statements. So the problem basically was the one I was saying a second ago, is like the Symfony autoloader doesn't know where Zen Framework 1 classes live and vice versa. So I have these two projects together, and one autoloader is like all good at finding classes over here, and the other one's good at finding classes over here. But they can't find each other's classes, so we have to set up and configure both of those autoloaders. So it ends up being like a town where every store has its own currency. It's just not something that is efficient at all. So the first thing, and this is the most important thing that the group has done, this is the PSR0, and you will hear this term if you haven't, this may be familiar to you if you haven't actually had it defined any before, is the group came together and they said, enough already, let's all start naming our classes in the same similar way. And so thou shalt name your classes by following a predictable pattern. And it seems like a really, really small deal, but this changed everything. So this is a Symfony 1 class. And basically, just based off of the class name, you don't know where that lives in your project. Maybe you know that all the Symfony classes live inside some libvendor Symfony directory, so you know it's in there somewhere. But after that, who knows how this is organized, what subdirectories are there, what the name of this file is. Probably it's called sfrequest.php, but maybe not. In fact, in Symfony 1, that wasn't even the name of the file. So with PSR0, when the groups came together, they said, okay, enough of that. Let's all name our classes following this pattern. And you probably, well, hopefully, some of you definitely seen this. It follows it, and you guys like that? That was like my one animation that I brought in. This is basically, so this is PHP namespaces here. And so, okay, it's very simple. Whatever the class name is, the namespace of the class is going to be the same as the directory structure. And then we're going to take the class name and add a .php on the end of it. And it's just that simple. It seems like a kind of a stupid thing, but it's like, okay, if you have this class, it needs to live in some directory that matches it. Doesn't matter where exactly you put it to start with, but like once you start this source directory here, it has to follow that pattern. And the importance of this is now if Zen Framework does this, and Symfony does this, and Drupal 8 does this, then there's one autoloader who can follow this pattern. That can be, you have the Symfony autoloader, and all of a sudden Symfony autoloader gets fed a Drupal 8 class, and Symfony's like, I know how to find that. You just do a little, slash flippy thing, add .php, and that's no problem. I can find Drupal 8's classes. I got it. So we don't have to configure everybody's autoloaders independently. They all do the exact same thing. So in fact, this is what it would look like to use Symfony's autoloader with Zen Framework. You know, this happens to be Symfony's autoloader, and we basically say any class names that start with Zen, they live in this directory. And so if we're looking for like zen/foo/bar, it's going to look here /zen/foo/bar.php. And it's that simple. And the cool thing about these autoloaders is they all do the exact same thing. So it's kind of funny. They all agreed to name their classes the same way, which means that all the autoloaders do the exact same thing. But we still have like Symfony's autoloader and Zen Framework's autoloader, and like every framework has their own autoloader. What's cool is they literally all do the exact same thing because they're all just following this naming pattern. And so for those of you guys that have done some projects that use autoloaders like this, I would say the most common, like if you started with Symfony 2 for the first time today, the most common error you will get is a class not found error. Because you typoed something. And that's one of the realities. So for you guys that get into this, when you start using namespaces and the autoloader and stuff like that, because the autoloader is just doing this simple transformation, a lot of times you'll you'll flip the U and the E in the file name. That gives you a class not found because it's looking for this class. So it's looking for a request.php spelled correctly. So it's really cool. The autoloader is actually really dumb. It's just doing this, flipping of the slashes thing. What causes it, you'll end up getting class not found errors, but it's always our fault as developers because we've typoed something. There's no logic in the autoloader.
Just don't spell Symfony too correctly.
You don't spell it too correctly, yeah. Something I started the way here where I was reading a Symfony 1 book, and you guys obviously can see if you're not familiar that Symfony spelled with an F because it's French, and like in the first 3 pages they spelled Symphony correctly twice. In a Symphony book, like Symphony, I was like, you have got to be kidding me. And it's just like some poor developer who gave it to their editor, and their editor ran it through spell check, and probably the developer is mortified. Anyways, okay, so now we have everything to bring in this lovely fellow composer. And for those of you I'll post these online afterwards, but for those of you that are taking notes, this is where things start to get really practical really fast. So Composer, what it is, fortunately, it's very, very simple. It's an executable, so it's an executable that will run from the command line that downloads libraries into your project. And that's basically it. It's a glorified downloader. The second thing it helps you with is autoloading. And it's going to use all that PSR0 stuff in the background that we just talked about. But basically, it's going to download stuff, and then it's going to handle all the autoloading nightmare for us. So let's go through the 5 steps of using it. I'll go through all these individually. First of all, what is I'll ask that in a question. So the first thing you're going to do is, I said that Composer is an executable file. So the first thing is just to download it. And this is the command that you run, which you don't expect anyone to memorize. This just literally comes right from their website. You go to getcomposer.org/download, and you run this cute command. If you happen to be on Windows, then there's a slightly different command because you probably don't have curl. But basically, you just run this. That's a funny little command, but all it actually does is downloads a single file called composer.phar. Somebody tell me what a phar file is.
It's a PHP file.
And why is it so special? What does it allow us to do, or how do we use it?
Is it proprietary code?
It's not. It's a little bit mangled, but not mangled enough.
It's an archive file.
Yes, and so why is it useful for us? Yeah, it is an archive file, which means we have many PHP files inside of a single PHP file.
I don't know, but can you use it as an executable?
Bingo. Yes, it's how many people have used? Well, I've used them, but I didn't know exactly what I was doing. How many people have used jar files before? Okay, what's a jar file? It's like a single Java file that you can just run from it's just everything's inside there. I don't have to compile anything. It's just right there. So PHP developers know a good thing when they see it. So we just stole that from them, and we just changed the J to a PH so that they wouldn't notice, right? But it's the perfect prime.
We're not proud. It's practical.
Yeah, it's so true. Yeah. And there are so many things that we do that steal. I mean, even Composer, right, is really a response to the other language, Pip and Python and and Gems, and there's one other one too. Yeah, NPM would be a really good example. Yeah, so it's just like kind of a response to those, to pretty much every other language having something like it. So anyways, this is an executable file that's all wrapped into one, which means you can copy this file, you can move it around, you can like put it on a thumb drive and put it on somebody else's computer. There's no dependencies, nothing happened on your system, it just downloaded this file. And it's completely standalone. And you can, like I said, duplicate it and have, if you have 50 projects, you could have a composer.phar file in all 50 directories of all 50 projects in your system. You can also put it into like your bin directory if you want to have just one on your system, but there's nothing special about this file. Cool, and then to run it, PHP space composer.phar, and that's it. And what it's going to give us, right now, nothing too interesting, is just a menu of things it can do. So remember that when you can't remember what command to run, just run PHP composer.phar and it's going to give you the menu. But it's just an executable file. In fact, I've never actually tried it. These phar files are actually really cool. I've seen presentations where you can apparently also put like web assets in them. You can actually, in theory, actually just put a entire website in them and actually be serving CSS and JS files from this one phar file. So they're kind of fancy things. Cool, so we downloaded composer.phar. We ran one command, we got the phar file, and that's it. Next thing, we need to figure out what we're actually going to install into our project. And by the way, what I'm going through right now, this works for every single PHP project ever. So your Drupal 5 project, whatever, that's fine. That's a terrible place to be, but you can use Composer inside of there and start bringing in some modern libraries to use immediately inside your custom modules. So it's not even a framework thing. You can do the same thing inside WordPress, obviously into the frameworks. This is going to work as well. So Composer installs packages, which is a fancy way to say it installs directories with stuff in it. And usually that stuff is PHP classes, but it could be anything. In fact, a lot of times people use Composer. It's not really the right tool, but people use Composer to install like jQuery and things like that in their project because it's a glorified downloader. So it downloads it into your project. Hey, it works. Every package, of course, has a unique name, and we look up those unique names at like the central repository, which is called packages.org. So when you're like trying to figure out what you want to install, that's where you go to, or you read some library's documentation and they tell you what their name is. So this is Packagist, and you see it's fairly attractive. So example here. So I go to Packagist, and I'm like, I gotta do something with menus on my site. So I'm gonna type in menu here and just kind of see what's going on. Okay, I found one, and it doesn't actually show up here, but because this is an older screenshot. But there's even like ratings and number of downloads. You can start, even without like looking at anything else, you can start to kind of see, is this like some guy in his basement in Russia, or is this like lots of people working this project together? So we search for something, we find the name of the package, which is always in the something/something format. And then the only other thing we have to do is figure out like what version we want. So we scroll down a little bit, we see a couple different versions here. There's dev-master, which is just a master branch. Probably it's bleeding edge. There's also a development branch, which always has kind of like this format. And this is probably unstable too. And then we finally find a version. So obviously if there's something that has like a full, 3 numbers there, 1.1.2, that's a stable version, it's been tagged, so this is probably what we want. And of course with all of these, you can just like, if you go to the documentation, it'll probably tell you, but we can actually just go behind the scenes and just look for stuff and kind of figure it out all of ourselves. So this we want the name, the version. Cool. So we download the file, we have the package and the version that we want. And then the key to putting this all together is to create a composer.json file. This sits at the root of your project. That was totally me. That was totally my bad right there. I went like this a second ago and I felt myself hit play, and I looked back to see if I had accidentally advanced it, and your computer started playing. That's never happened before. That was actually pretty awesome. I apologize. I had to bail you out there. I can see you being like, what? I'll play you guys out to that later.
Volume's off now.
Come on. Looks like I can't. So the key to tying this all together is at the root of your project, you'll create this composer.json file. Okay? And there's other stuff that can get inside of here, and on the website it kind of tells you the other keys, but really the only key we care about is this require key, the name of the library, and the version that we want. And it's that simple. We're basically telling Composer like what stuff do we want to download into our project. It's a really simple idea. Or if you want to get like a nice interactive thing, this is PHP composer.phar init. It'll kind of ask you some questions about your project and help you set up this file the first time. Cool. So finally we get to the goods. We're actually going to download the files via Composer. So just to review, the only things we have so far is the composer.phar executable and a really simple JSON file. and that's it. We haven't modified our system, nothing's happened weird with our project, like it's very hands-off, just these two things. Cool. So to actually tell Composer to read the JSON file and download libraries, we run php composer.phar install. And it's that simple. Cool? So you can see here, it's grabbing KP Labs KP menu at version 1.1.2. And what that is actually doing in the background is two things. One, it's downloading it into the vendor directory. This is really important. How many people have used PAIR before? How many people have liked using PAIR? I actually thought maybe I get like one hand or something. So PAIR is hard because for better or worse, it downloads things like globally to your system. And then you have to have like your include paths in PHP like pointing to whatever directory that it installed in. You're not even sure what directory it installed it into. And then when you push your project to like your server, it breaks because you also need to do this install on the server. So Composer doesn't do any of that. It just downloads everything into your vendor directory. So everything is happening 100% within your project, which means you can put it on a jump drive and take it somewhere else. Obviously they have to have like PHP installed. If you're using like PHP extensions like the MySQL extension, you need those. But basically your project is completely standalone in this directory. Just zip it up and send it off. Don't like what you just did? Just blow out that directory and go out to lunch. Not that big of a deal. Nothing weird is happening on your system. So the install downloads things into your vendor directory and then also prepares in the background some magic for the autoloading. And we'll see like what that means in a second, but basically it's going to make our life easy when we start to use things. And then finally, like, we're just going to start using stuff. So all this looks like, and you'll see this code all over the place when you look at Composer, is this is any file in your application right here. So anywhere in the application, so Composer downloaded the KP menu library into the vendor directory, and it also generated this autoload.php file automatically. As long as we require that, we can just start referencing the classes inside that library without doing anything else. There's no like set include paths or like something specific to this library. You include that, and everything that Composer brought in, you can just start using immediately. And like that's the true thing that really lowers the barrier of entry big time. As long as you have the name of the library and the version, you can start using it immediately. Awesome. So as you can see, I won't talk about this, but basically this is a little library that helps you create menu structure. So I just use it. I'm going to echo it, and in this case, I was just going to prove it, execute it from the command line, and lo and behold, it goes out and uses those classes and dumps out some menu stuff. Awesome. Somebody know what that's from?
Reddit?
Yeah. Probably. Has anybody used HipChat? Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, this is one of the icons of HipChat. It's like the fuck yeah guy. Is this, yeah. Alright, so we have one library. How can we bring in more libraries? So this is good. So in our Drupal 7 project, we're writing a custom module. We just found out this external library would be really good for us to bring in. So we made a composer.json file, we added it to it, and we started using it inside of our custom Drupal module or CodeIgniter project or wherever. So now we want to bring in something else. So let's grab something else. We go through that same process. We find another library called Symfony/Finder. We stick it in there. And then we run composer.phar install. Or not. This is where it gets slightly a little bit more complicated. We run composer.phar update. Because, this is really cool but important, when you originally run composer install, it creates, remember all we did was create that composer.json file. When we ran install the first time, it read the JSON file, and it created a composer.lock file automatically next to it. So now we have a JSON file that we made, and we have a lock file next to it that was made on our behalf. The composer.lock file has been written with the exact details of the exact versions of the libraries that were downloaded. Okay, so it's like a snapshot of like, I downloaded this library at like 1.1.2. Okay, like dead snapshot. So when we run install, after that initial time, once there is a composer.lock file, when we run install, it actually ignores the JSON file and instead reads from the lock file. And I'll explain why in a second. Whereas the update command, this is the one that says, no, forget about the lock file. Actually read the JSON file, reparse it, update everything in there to the latest versions that are specified, and then rewrite the lock file. Okay? The purpose of the lock file is because day to day, if you have a team of 5 developers or so, like one person, one of you guys is actually going to be the one that's going to create the composer.json file and put a library into it. Then you're going to run install, and it's going to generate the lock file. You're going to commit the lock file to the repository. I'm going to come into work tomorrow and pull it down, and I'm just going to run composer install. And whatever version you downloaded, like 1.1.2, I get 1.1.2. Even if 1.1.3 of that library came out overnight, like it's reading your lock file has the exact version that's in your project. So day by day, we all just run around running install, and it makes sure that all of us have the exact same versions of each other, because the lock file has, if we have 10 libraries, it has all 10 libraries listed in there at their exact versions. Because again, like in the example we brought in, my composer.json file said, hey, get that KMP menu library at like 1.1.2. But sometimes you might have stuff that's like 1.1 star, so it could be anything, So we want to lock it, because if it reparses the composer.json file every time, it may update us if there are actually new stuff that's coming, some new release.
So basically, the workflow is every time you add something to composer.json, you want to run the command and then commit the lock file.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, the only time, actually, good transition. The only time you'll use update is when you are actually adding something to composer.json, or you are updating a version of one of the libraries in composer.json. You're making a change. You run update. It rewrites the lock file. You commit the lock file. I come into work tomorrow and just pull down the latest code, and at worst, I have to run install just to make sure I'm synced up. And that's it. I'm always in sync with you. Yep.
So even if I'm not adding a new library to my composer.json file, unless I want to consciously maybe update and pull down the newest versions, let's say I have like a 1.2 point star in my in my JSON file.
Mm-hmm.
The only time I should really do update is when I want to consciously pull down all the latest versions.
Exactly right.
But otherwise, like if I have the rest of my team, they should always use install.
Exactly right. Yeah, always use install. Yeah, you said it perfectly. And actually, on that note, update does take an optional arguments too. You can say normally update. One of the questions that you'd obviously think here is like, well, does it update everything? You're like, I just wanted to update this one. You can also say composer.phar update space Symfony/Finder. You can even give it 4, 5, 6 arguments, whichever libraries you want to update.
Okay.
Cool, composer.phar updates, and this time it grabs Symfony/Finder. So that's exactly what we expected. And behind the scenes, actually you can see over here, writing lock file. So it's writing the new composer.lock file. And if you look at the composer.lock file, it's really big and ugly, but it's a JSON file. It's just very, very detailed information about the exact versions that you have. And then once again, we're just going to start using the library immediately. As long as we have this require at the top, we're totally ready to go. So in practice, what this means is you guys are going to probably put this require somewhere in some bootstrap file you have, some settings.php, whatever your most core bootstrap thing is. You'll have that require there just once, and then anywhere and everywhere else in your code, you can just start going to town on whatever components that you brought in. Okay. And this is a particularly cool one, super simple, but like Finder, it's a Symfony component that just helps you traverse through directory structures. This is finding all GIF files that have been created 1 day ago or less. So something that would be kind of annoying to write in PHP, but there's a component out there for that. Awesome. So real quick, let's talk about these version numbers here. This one obviously is really easy to understand. Then I pulled out this weird tilde 2.3 thing. So let's look at the different versions formats. Clearly you can have the exact version, simple, grab that one. Or you can do this range thing, which I found a little bit hard to read, but you guys get the idea, 1.0 but less than 2.0, so anything inside that range. Or you can do the wildcard, that one's really easy to read as well. Or you can do the slightly more awesome tilde operator, which works like this. Tilde 1.2 means greater than 1.2 but less than 2.0. So stay with me here. Tilde 1.2.3 means greater than or equal to 1.2.3 but less than 1.3. So the point here is when you use the tilde, only the last number you specify gets to change. And it can only go in the up direction. This number can't change. So 1.3 is too high, because that's this number, but 1.2 point anything, as long as it's 1.2.3 or greater, is going to work out. Even all up to 1.2.11, 1.2.12. So this is a really good way where you're like, oh, I'm just using 1.2, and it's cool if I'm using 1.2.3, but it's cool if it goes up to 1.2.10, because I know those are just bug fixes. But maybe 1.3 is a little hardcore, because I know this library likes to kind of break backwards compatibility sometimes on their minor versions. So I'm going to chill and just use this. So you'll see this more and more. Like this is the one that you want to kind of shoot for. It's similar to the tilde, or sorry, similar to the asterisk, the star, but it's a little more flexible because with the star we would have said 1.2 point star, so that would have let it go to 1.2.2 or 1.2.1 or 1.2.0. So it's a little more control on like what your bottom level is. Awesome. And I'll post this online so you guys don't have to write these down really quickly, but for your reference later when you see this online, I wanted to basically point out the other few topics that you'll need to look at with Composer you'll probably run into soon. So basically, like that's the flow. That's basically it. Like run to your craziest, ugliest, old legacy projects that they make you work on against your will, and start using this. Or your fancy brand new project in some framework. Like this works across the board. And go out and start finding libraries to use. The other things that you might come into is creating private dependencies, meaning we have like a shared plugin within our company. That's totally possible. It's a question I get a lot. Auto-loading your own classes. So if you want to have your own classes in your project and have that fancy autoloader, also find those magically. That's easy to do. Stability flags is another one. So if you start bringing in libraries that are only at their beta version, there's kind of a way to tell Composer to get this at the beta version. Otherwise, Composer by default, if you point it at like a beta version of something, it'll kind of blow up and be like, I don't know of any version that works because it's trying to find the only stable stuff. So that's kind of an important thing to look at. Like, no, I do want beta there. Question?
Yeah, is that has something to do with the minimum stability?
It is, yeah, it's related to that. Yeah. And you and I can talk afterwards. There's a way to specify in your composer.json file as a whole that I'm okay with having beta or dev versions across everything. And by default, it's called the minimum stability flag. By default, it's only stable stuff. But then on a line-by-line basis in composer.json, you can say, go get this at beta. You can say like, go get this library and it's at like 1.0, or like 0.9 and that's a beta version, but you can say 0.9 at beta and that forces it to beta. You're like, yes, I know it's at beta. I'm cool with that. Go get it. So this talks about that. And the last thing is optimizing the autoloader. The autoloading process on larger projects can add some overhead, but you can get rid of it really, really easily. There's like literally one command that you can run before you deploy your application that will just like make it faster. And we're talking, we're talking slow when you have a performance site. Like it's not like this is adding like a second to your request time. And literally, like you run this one command, and that all goes away anyways. So it doesn't have to be an overhead, but that's basically a free performance boost. Cool. Last little thing here, because I want to encourage you guys to go and find this, is like how do we find libraries? Obviously, Google and Twitter and follow smart people that are kind of talking about new libraries. But I actually do this all the time. Like go to Packagist or go to GitHub. GitHub is actually really good for this. GitHub, repositories, PHP, search for it, find it, use it. We all know that it's going to show like the number of forks and stars. We can actually see like, is this a good library or is this just like somebody's random weekend project and it's not worth me using? So do definitely do this. Yeah, in fact, that's probably the way that I find things most of the time. Or you may find that there's nothing. In rare cases, we all want to work together. In rare cases, you may find out there's nothing, and you may find out that you hacked out something in your last project, and maybe that's the birth of some new little open source project that you're solving. That would be pretty cool. As long as you search for it on GitHub, you'll have a pretty good idea that, in this day and age, it's going to be on GitHub or it doesn't exist. Some favorites, I'll just you can write these down if they're interesting to you. Mink, which is what I'm going to talk about tomorrow in part. This is a PHP library that allows you to command browsers. So you think of like if you're writing a crawler, like go to this page, find the H1 tag, find this link, click this link, go to the next page, fill this form, press submit. Those types of things. You can do it right inside PHP. As an added bonus, you can get this to pop up in Selenium. So you can actually use PHP and then you run the code and bam, it's actually opening up in a real browser. Or you can run it in a headless browser behind the scenes. But really, really useful, especially for testing. Then another one is Monolog, which is a really, really solid logging library. And the good thing about Monolog is it just has lots of these things called handlers, which basically help you stream logging into lots of different places. So you can log to a database and files and all kinds of weird things that I've never heard of before. That Fire PHP handler is actually like a thing that logs your application's log data to a special header on your response. Instead of using Fire PHP or Chrome PHP, you see your error messages coming out of your browser. It's weird stuff like that. And of course, the Symfony components, the Zen framework components. this day and age, it's fortunately, like, if you want to be a cool developer kid, you don't, well, it's not entirely true, but more and more, you want to create a component that everybody can use versus a CodeIgniter plugin or a Symfony bundle. So more and more we are finding things that we can actually share across languages, but it's still not quite as good as it should be. Awesome. So last things I'll say, reasons to be really excited about the future of PHP. Like, we've come so far the past 2 or 3 years. We're just like leapfrogging. It's like we were asleep for 5 or 10 years, and all at once we made up all of that in basically like 2 or 3 years all at once. So first thing is look for participation and consolidation. So this is actually really cool. A lot of you guys, I heard like Drupal, I heard, and there's a Laravel talk coming up. This is actually the note that I took earlier. So Drupal 8, probably many of you guys know, is built on some Symfony components. And Laravel 4, same thing, is built on some Symfony components. Of course, I'm a Symfony guy, so that's like what I know. But like this kind of stuff is happening more and more and more. So we're actually getting like more shared solutions and more interoperability. And it means that if you are a Laravel developer and all of a sudden you come to a Symfony project or vice versa, like instantly you're like, oh, yeah, I get this. This is literally the same classes I was using in my last job. Like, this is fine, I got it. So this is really, really cool. So shared building blocks is cool for people that do these things, but it ultimately is really, really cool for us. And the one I poke at is less library duplication. This is something that we're awesome at in the PHP community. It's like, hey, here's what we should do. You need a logger, I need a logger. Let's run in opposite directions and both develop them as fast as we can. Right? Instead of actually working together. So, you know, these are the two I pick on because, you know, historically they don't get along very well, Zen Framework and Symfony communities. So they create the same components and they give them the same names and they pretend like the other one doesn't exist. And I throw them both under the bus for that. It's probably nobody's fault. And I certainly am not helping it. Another thing is more high quality community grown libraries. So the really cool thing here is that when I need a Drupal module or a CodeIgniter plugin, it's a more of a box solution. It's a little bit bigger, like it should kind of work out of the box, all the configuration should be there. But with the components, I can just solve one little problem. I can be like, you know what's hard to do? It's hard to get a date and then figure out what is 6 business days from now based on the local holidays. Right? You could write that in like 1 or 2 classes, and that would be a really awesome library. And you could post that; it would probably be really popular. So the solutions themselves are really, really small. So we're gonna have like less from the top of like, let me wait for fill in the blank fearless leader of fill in the blank framework to make this solution for me, and much more people from the ground up being like, I'll do this, I'll do this, I'll do this, I'll do this. We have this really high quality libraries, small solutions coming from many people. Which is a good thing, and these people up here that I'm sort of like poking at, like they like this too. It's not like they're getting their power taken away. They want the community to grow and all these, you know, and all these solutions to come up. So find these, for these, and of course on the documentation guide, write their documentation. Boy, yeah, one thing that programmers do really well is like create libraries. One thing they don't do really well is document them. Until you come along and you use it and you find all these problems with the documentation and then you update it, and that's really the catalyst a lot of times for what makes these libraries take off. You know, you have some good guy, but you finding it is actually validation that's a good solution, and then helping out the documentation is kind of taking them to the next level. Of course, then you become a contributor. It's just it's the best way to contribute if that's something that you don't do very often, because the barrier to entry is so low. Easier upgrades, that's a little bit more subtle. And the last thing is like grow your community. Like if you're in, like this is going back to the thing, if you're in Symfony, Drupal, CodeIgniter, like that is your community of course, but like we can start to seep outside of that because there are all these libraries that go across things and we can use Composer to bring them in really nicely. So grow that and use the libraries that actually work, even if they aren't from your community. This is a big thing, and Symfony people are definitely guilty of this. Like there's a logger by some guy in the Symfony community, and there's some logger by some guy in some other community. I'm probably going to use the one in the Symfony community. But the more we can do that, and the more we can actually step back and be like, okay, which one's actually better, the more we're going to help the community as a whole, because we're going to pour our votes into the one that's actually the best, even if it's not actually coming from our familiar community space. And just leverage the kind of billions and billions of us. There are not that many, but you guys get the idea. Cool, and that is it. So, does anybody have any questions? Yes?
We keep running into the same problem over and over with Composer, in which like especially some of the Zen framework stuff.
Yeah.
They basically get the paths to certain files wrong in the autoload. Like they'll set a base path to the current working directory, but the problem is to get to the vendor/library, you have to go up one level. And
Good. Yeah. So actually, like, and I totally, well, this is us in Halloween, like a couple years ago, but like, I'm gonna shoot back to that because I'm actually glad you brought that up because I was, sometimes when you're presenting, you kind of like, shovel a few details around, somewhere that nobody will see. I try not to do it very often, but one that I did shovel under was this one. This is what you're talking about right here, right? So you're like, what if this file is like, or not even this file, what if the file that's being executed is in some different spot? So basically the vendor, this is not looking for the vendor directory where you expect it, it's looking in some other directory, so you get file in that file basically on the vendor/autoload. So what you should have here, well, I mean, it depends on your project, but typically what you're going to do is you're going to have this in front of it, and __dir__ means the directory of this very file. Because normally, like, when we just say this, we use this relative path, what this is going to do, this is going to give us the relative path to whatever file was first executed, which is a weird thing. It's not this file. It's like, if some other directory is actually what's handling the web request, like web/index.php, then the current directory is the web directory. So you're like, okay, cool, let's just change this to .. Like, hold on a second. You also sometimes have this command line application, which is at the root of your project and then uses this. So now the current working directory is the root directory. And so you're like, oh, let's change it. Crap, we can't worship both of those. So the __dir__ means this directory of this file, and so it solves that problem. And so the second part of it is typically, and tell me if this is possible or if it solves your problem, typically you're going to have this require only in one spot, and it's going to be in like one bootstrap file. And so then like, even if you're 3 directories deep at that point, you can say require dir __dir .. vendor/autoload.php. But you only have that in one file. It's a bootstrap file. It's executed at the beginning of every request, and then you don't have to worry about it anywhere else. Because the __dir is going to fix that for you, but if you have this sprinkled across 20 different files, then it is going to be annoying every time to figure out like how many directories deep you are to see how many .. you need. But you only need one.
Well, what's really weird is that this is based on the Zen skeleton application.
I've used that before, yeah.
Yeah, and then if you use Composer to pull in the Zen framework tool, I always have to go into the autoloader and change all this because they have a base path variable and they assume it's in the vendor is in a forward directory when you have to go back a directory.
That's interesting. Let's look at that after. I wonder if the base dir should be maybe using this, though maybe using the __dir__, but like they're also really smart guys, so I'm sure they thought of that. So let's look at it afterwards so we can figure out what like piece, because it almost seems like we're missing a piece. Like there's a reason it's that way, but we don't know why yet.
Okay.
Yep.
This is a very simple question. I'm new to Composer, but you mentioned GitHub and packages.
Mm-hmm.
How do you tell Composer to look at one or the other?
Oh, good. Composer only looks at packages. That's the repository. And in fact, for example, Zen Framework actually has their own packages, so there is a way in configuration. In rare cases, if you're pulling things from, for example, Zen Framework, there's something you can put in your composer.json that says, oh, in addition to packages, also look at this other repository. So then when you install packages, it's looking at things in packages, and it's also looking at things over here. But in normal, like in my development, that never happens unless I happen to be using a Zen framework. They're kind of like one of the few people that host their things elsewhere. The GitHub is just basically a way to find libraries. And typically, once you find that library on GitHub and you kind of verify that it's popular, you'll see in their README, they'll say like I'm on Packagist and my name is this. So Packagist is like the end all be all. GitHub has a little better way of finding them and verifying whether or not they're good or not. Mm-hmm.
I think I know the answer to this, but you mentioned using Composer in some cases to maybe pull down jQuery or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking at trying to use it for something like that for what I need it for. Is there anything built into Composer that would support moving those static files out of the vendor directory and into a different directory?
Totally, yeah.
Accessible?
No, there's not. And it's kind of by design just because it's not meant to do that.
Right.
What I would do is, I'm trying to remember. No, yeah, that would do it. There is something where, but I don't think this applies, where individual libraries can like say that they're in a different directory, but I don't think that applies. Basically, it's something you have to do yourself, and a good spot to do that is in a post-install script. Seen like the scripts key in composer.json?
Okay.
Yeah, so there's a scripts key in composer.json that says after install, like run this script of mine, and that script can do anything you want. So in that case, it'd be like post-install script, go find this directory and copy it into my web directory, or symbolically link it into my web directory.
Okay.
Yeah, so
I had one more. Part of my job is like working these new things into our workflow, and then the other half is teaching some of our less technical people how to use it. Are you familiar with any GUI clients for Composer, or is it like plugins that work with Composer? Because like I work with a lot of people that are very
Yeah, I don't use it in my day-to-day, but Sensio Labs Desktop. They is a product that is exactly for that. Like I don't use it because I'm more a command line guy. But it's exactly why they made it. They want to like be able to bring Composer to like the more WordPress themer masses in a sense as much as possible. So just check that out. We also have a free video on our Campaign Diversity site for more back-end people to kind of go through this kind of stuff and get their hands dirty. Yeah. There's another question?
Yeah, I was, and this is more of a simple question, but with aesthetic, with that library, when you move into the production environment, I'm sort of still in dev, I want to use things in Symfony 2 as in a dev site, but I'm seeing all these things that I'm going to have to do once I move it into production. To the question he asked about having using Composer to pull in jQuery into the vendor directory per the standard, is aesthetic something that would address that problem eventually, or is you can keep any kind of a file that you're going to reference?
It does address it. Yeah, this is like kind of Symfony specific, but it does address it with JavaScript files because you can. In your JavaScript tag, you can give it an absolute path to files. And we'll talk about after. There's also another way to do it with configuration, where you basically say, when I refer to jQuery, it's physically in this directory over here. So aesthetic is able to go grab it out of a non-public directory and then publish it later. Doesn't work for CSS files though, because that movement messes up their paths. And so you get, if you have like relative paths from CSS files to images, then like things might get weird there, but it does work with JavaScript files. For JavaScript files and CSS files, it's downloading them in your project's not that hard. If you really want to have somebody download it because you don't want to commit it to your repository, like I recommend checking out Bower, or there's a couple other ones that run the same thing. It's basically like the front end, whereas NPM is kind of like the node packages. Like Bower is like literally go find this JavaScript library and download it into my like web/assets directory. And then you just maintain like a little JSON file there that looks like the composer.json file, but it's for JavaScript stuff.
How do you spell that?
Bower, B-O-W-E-R. Yep. And it's really simple.
Have you ever experienced a problem with Composer when running a Composer update, it hangs?
It does hang for, okay. Well, like hang permanently? Or just for a long time?
Long enough that I've given up, like, good at half an hour.
I've not run anything with a half an hour. So that, and unfortunately, I've not run into that. You'd have to, with that you'd have to start taking out some dependencies and basically seeing what the weird bottleneck is.
Yeah, it was a project we inherited and they had a lot of dependencies. And we Googled for this kind of problem, a few people mentioned it. And it could be because it was trying to work out packaging dependencies and was going into a loop.
You'd think it would detect that, but it definitely sounds that way to me. When you run composer update, when you start getting a fairly long composer.json file and you run composer update, it can take several minutes to run. It has like a fairly sophisticated package dependency logic that it goes through. So if you run it and it's hanging, like let it go. Fortunately, the updates aren't run very often anyway, so every couple of weeks you need to update something, or you need to run an update, have it take like 3 or 4 minutes, it's not that big of a deal. Install is always lightning fast because it's just like, composer.lock file, thank you. And it doesn't actually do any logic.
And there's self-updates as well.
Oh yeah. I'm glad I remember that. Every now and then when you run Composer, it'll say your Composer's out of date, you should update it, and you were just running PHP composer.phar self-update, and it just downloads a new version over itself. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up so you can always keep it up to date. Yep, sorry.
No, I run an app that we deployed to multiple different stacks and nodes. Like, is it best practices to put the FAR inside the GitHub code base and then run it from there? Or it should always be curled in?
Yeah, you're not like best practice is not because it's a vendor thing.
Yeah.
And at least so far, Composer hasn't had any has not had like any backwards compatibility breaks. So normally that'd be the one thing, right? Like you'd be like, well, what if I deploy to my server and it downloads like a new one?
Yeah.
That's not an issue. So the best practice is not to, but sometimes I do for practicality purposes. Just you take a shortcut in your deploy script. Like, well, if we just it's already there, then we can just like git clone on the servers and just run it and save this and stuff. So I don't worry about it one way or another. Also, like for more junior developers or people trying to get started with the project, if you have the file there, it just makes it a little easier for them. But it doesn't matter. But you shouldn't have it there.
And there's no way to change vendor. Vendor is always where it puts it, right? So
You can change it. Yeah, you can change vendor. I don't remember what the key is, but on Composer's website they have a big schema for where all the keys are. There's a target directory that you can configure, I believe, to go somewhere else. Yeah, and actually, yeah. And really, the vendor directory doesn't end up being special in any way at all. Like if you weren't Composer install, it puts in the vendor directory. But if you rename that to something else, your application would still work as long as you were requiring, vendor foo/autoload.php. Of course, next time you ran Composer, it would think everything's missing and download the vendor, but just kind of highlighting the name of the directory, other than that happens to be where Composer puts its stuff, is not important for the functioning of your application. One more question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you knew if running I've installed Composer globally, like in the bin directory.
Mhm.
Does running self-update work there as well?
It does, yeah. You depending on where it is, you might have to sudo it.
Sure.
But totally works there. Yeah, you'll get the same error where it's out of date. And that's a good way to do it. So eventually you get sophisticated, you just install it globally in your system so that you don't have 75 composer.phar files across your machine. But you can if you want to, it doesn't hurt.
okay, so it doesn't have to be inside a directory in order to work.
Oh yeah, totally. You can have it globally installed. So
Okay,
like,
that's
a really common thing with like vagrant setups. You'll just install Composer into some global thing and you're vagrant and then you're good to go.
It's much better not to have it in there because once you version it, then that's going to always be out of date when that self-update, when that 30-day window closes.
Yeah, you'll have to recommit the update.
Yeah.
In 30 days when you self-update, and then you have like a version, a git log on your composer.phar file. And actually, in your situation, that's actually a good point. Like if you have it installed globally, and you actually have using Puppet or something like that to actually spin up your different servers, then you, in a sense, have like even the version of Composer itself version. Because you have it's coming from some Puppet.
Yeah.
Thing.
I just had to work inside. So basically, you just run the bin, change directory through a script, and then run it straight from.
Yeah, you can CD in your project and be like /ops/ whatever.
Yeah, we have to do that already for the deploy anyway. So
Yep.
That's fine.
Yeah, you got that. Solid. Cool. All right. Thank you guys very much.